within Kaizen, we've seen obviously this massive change around our working environment. We've shifted seamlessly to a home working environment, and the teams seem to be working really well.
Yeah, I think it's been largely the same. I mean, we're a cloud native company, and that meant when it came time to, which literally was overnight, transition to remote working, the company was well equipped to do that. We do a Zoom coffee break twice a day, and people are joining that and socially engaging in ways that they wouldn't in a normal office environment. So when we look at things like surveillance and market abuse, we're seeing huge demand on compliance professionals to have to fulfill a greater workload than they've ever had to face before. When we look at the ability to respond to claims by clients, by the regulators, by the market, firms still have to do that in a very fast and responsive way. On the reporting side, again, the regulators are not saying anything different. I mean, what's your view on the reporting side?
Well, much like the surveillance, reporting and surveillance is coming to the fore now, because we're in a situation where the regulator needs visibility and transparency of what's happening in the marketplace. And that's where I think data quality comes into its own, and the quality of the reporting regimes themselves. So how fit for purpose is EMEA as it stands today? Is it going to allow them to identify systemic risk when we're facing an uncertain and fragile financial sector because of the impact of the COVID-19? On surveillance as well, like you were saying, I mean, we've got traders that are now taken out of the trading floor and trading remotely at home. So the regulator is looking for enhanced oversight and maybe post-execution oversight that's enhanced rather than just the real time. And once we get back to a bit of normality, I think there's going to be quite a lot of scrutiny on what happened during this period.
And I think this is an example where we're going into a world where you suddenly get thrust into the cloud, where in organizations, financial organizations, where they've invested in compliance technologies, they may be recording voice, but they haven't been equipped to record voice remotely. And as a result, they weren't prepared for that. So the best thing they can do right now is put in policy. But I think what will immediately happen is there'll need to be a review, because those technologies are ingrained in how the human population interacts, and they'll have to figure out ways of making those compliant. If you have a trader at home and they're using their home line to transact business, how do you record that? And that's a requirement. You can't have these types of interactions taking place where they're not being surveyed and captured in many instances. So I think things will change. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think the only real way that can be addressed at this stage is the post-execution review, the scrutiny of the data, and the FCA will be using its tool set and be spending resources to look into that data in probably more depth than they would otherwise. They'll be active in looking for aberrant behaviour, unusual practices, that sort of thing, and any of the potential abuse practices that fall under MAR.
What we see from the FCA is regulation is still apparent. It's still an obligation. People still have to deliver on their requirements.
I think reporting itself has a natural tendency towards complexity. So products get more complex over time, but also the understanding by the regulators and the understanding of the nuances between products means that they have to evolve their regulations themselves over time, and that puts a heavy burden on firms. How do they keep pace with what the regulation requires? Plus, there's a great deal of interpretation around that. So it's very hard to get that level of expertise now across the financial sector, to have every firm have someone that understands the regulations in depth, to the minutiae that it requires to avoid errors.
Regulatory reporting is expensive, and it costs firms a lot of money. It costs time. It's a distraction.
It's going to just increase. There is a relationship, obviously, with regulations and the regulators' activities, and all their commentary to date has been about data quality needs to improve. And that's not just in the UK, that's further afield to MAS and ASIC, the sort of G20 regulations, as we refer to them, which sprung out of the sprung out of the credit crunch and the need to have the ability to see where systemic risk lay across the financial system as a whole.
As you start to look at the firms that are succeeding in solving regulatory problems and really doing it properly, they're the ones that are understanding going to vendors who really understand data is the answer to solving their problem. And I think, one of the reasons why we started SteelEye was that we believe that the data that's required for reporting and surveillance and best execution and analytics around regulation not only is consistent in many ways. So as you solve for regulatory problems, each regulation is leveraging very similar, if not the same data sets. But that data is also very meaningful for businesses. So what we wanted to do was build a platform that would allow people to bring data together, clean it up, aggregate it, and then leverage it for regulatory purposes with a longer outlook of being able to solve other problems, which could be kind of commercial value and operational efficiencies. We say all of the firms we've engaged with have been misreporting, and not by intent or any other purpose, that the legacy solutions out there were missing things or doing things in the wrong way, and it just never got picked up by the regulator or the market participant or any of the intermediaries. And what's exciting for us is as we have our clients come on board, especially existing ones who are using other parts of our platform, we solve these problems for them. So there's a lot of remediation work that happens just naturally as you start to look at things from a data-centric lens. Clearly, SFTR is the big one for this year. There are delays that the regulator has announced.
We've had this extension of a few months, and that's obviously going to be helpful, particularly under the current circumstances. And firms are using it to move forward their systems and their reporting readiness, but actually take the time to do some testing before essentially the real go live date. So that's great. The complexity of the regime is I would say on the extreme level, and it's in an area where there hasn't really been any regulatory reporting previously. So it is a huge step change. And that said, all the firms have been working to try and do this, but I suspect that whenever you're doing anything new and requiring a high degree of collaboration, you really need to have people in the same room. So this is where remote working starts to get a little bit more difficult. So if you're processing things and it's day-to-day operations, then yes, I think we're proving now, and across the city, we're proving that operations can continue. But when you're trying to create new things and develop and problem solve, that becomes more of a challenge. So I think it's very reasonable and necessary for that delay. I'd question whether that's going to be extended again. There is a possibility. I do think, though, because data quality is of such importance, and we have seen problems both with EMIR and MiFID data quality, which ESMA is highly aware of. The regulators will be under pressure to be more stringent and strident with firms a year or so into the regulation. So I do think post go live it will be, let's test the systems, let's try and sort out all the kinks in the system, and again, regulators will be learning through the process as well. So we've seen a whole series of updates on Q&As, many of which are essentially regulatory reporting changes, dressed up as guidance. But with the complexity of SFTR, I think that's going to be a torrent of change that's coming.
What was interesting to us last year was we saw very little enforcement interest in the market from the FCA when it came to MiFID. And where we actually saw the most interest of the regulators on our clients was around the market abuse regulation, which preceded MiFID II. So it was a regulation that came out just before 2016. That regulation came into effect. And there was no enforcement or very little enforcement on that. And suddenly last year, as the regulators were freed from the implementation of MiFID, what we saw was a lot of enforcement action and investigations around that. Then as you start to look at what's happening today with COVID, right? So there's the delay in SFTR. There's also a delay in best execution. Now, best execution was a key element of the regulation. It's one where we've seen very little enforcement from the regulators. And what we hear from our clients is, well, I got to generate an RTS 28 report once a year. Why buy a system for it? And what we hear is, well, we'll just throw a bunch of people at it every quarter because it's not a lot of work. Why buy a system? And as a result, a lot of people don't have those control systems in place. And once you get a system like that, those are not expensive technologies to put in. It's a data exercise. And once it's in, it's a press of a button. There's no excuse for not doing it. And I was surprised to hear the regulator under the COVID crisis say to the market, actually, you can have some more time because we understand the pain points. Because I don't believe that. I think firms that would have put in the right systems would not have pressure or pain. They can produce those reports literally at the click of a button. It's all those firms that didn't put in the systems, that do it manually, that are under pressure. And that's where the regulators should be coming in and saying that the systematic capabilities are there. So you shouldn't be using this as an excuse.
I totally agree. I mean, I think that there will be pressure on the regulators to look at that again, and there's not really been any updates to the obligations that need, in terms of, like, we have Q&As for MiFID II transaction reporting or the transparency reporting. And there hasn't been much on the best execution reporting. The other side of this, though, is that whilst there hasn't been much, or hasn't been any enforcement that we can see in a public way for RTS 27 and 28, it will become an issue from a senior management regime perspective, and the controls that the regulator expects the senior executive to have in place so that they can demonstrate the execution of their responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, the senior managers regime is such an interesting one, because in some ways it's a terrifying piece of regulation for the individual who's performing those executive management roles, and in other ways it's actually really important for accountability to be there in the executive structures of firms.
I totally agree. It's a massive step change. It's not just a kind of extension of the approved persons regime. This is really a dramatic alteration in the regulatory landscape. That regime is most at risk, I think, in reporting, where the firm's reporting failures are kind of easy to establish. They're kind of black and white. So for medium to large firms, the likelihood of the SMR regime being tested out against them was most likely to be, in my view, or more likely to be, in my view, around reporting breaches. So you can say that is a breach. So that's no longer that's no longer to be contested. It's the question of, well, has the SMR discharged their obligations, taken reasonable steps and so on to make sure reporting was correct, even though it, then subsequently it was discovered that it wasn't. So that means that SMR is a much greater risk area for reporting SMRs than I think in some other areas of the business where it's a little bit more nebulous. I'm firmly of the view that our services are the return to our clients isn't just avoiding regulatory sanction. There's a much higher return, and it's a measurable return where they're saving on remediation activities, they're saving on management time that has to go into this, and saving on investment of building out their own controls environments for assurance on recs and accuracy. And they are quite considerable. And the total cost of compliance, compliance costs are very hard to measure, but firms are now looking at that as a bottom line figure. That if you have good compliance, good practices, investment in compliant controls and compliance at the right point, that will drive profits to the bottom line and make the revenues and the profits more sustainable and more predictable for that business, because they know they're not going to get slammed with a massive fine or a massive investigation that they have to throw money at. So firms should be thinking about, okay, we've got to get live, but we have to resource the future as well, which will be that change program to keep up to date with the flow of changes coming from regulators. And often we see that the control piece is the last piece of the puzzle, because firms are too busy trying to just get reports out the door. The control piece gets forgotten. But that control piece can be a very important cost-saving measure for the firm, because generally anything that's wrong has to be corrected in the future. So if you put the controls in early, then you can sort of what we call stop the bleed as early as possible. It reduces the future cost. So it's not just about regulatory risk, it's cost, the total cost of reporting. And you have to include that audit, that remediation part into that calculation.
I think from my perspective, back to the original part of our conversation around data and being very data centric when it comes to focusing on regulation, that's where some of that value can come from. We see quite regularly financial firms executing through order management systems, having execution and portfolio platforms that sit behind that, that allow them to manage the overall life cycle of a transaction, and disconnects between those two environments, which can be timely to rectify, highly risky to the business in terms of getting real-time information. And as you solve regulatory challenges such as reporting, you do have the ability to fix some of those issues those firms are facing. Ultimately, by fixing some of those things, you can make your business more efficient, you can de-risk it, and bring added value to your firm. But we try to look for those opportunities where we can help fix something beyond regulation.
The other side of it is when individuals can have comfort that their reporting is of good quality, that means management attention gets diverted to where it matters, which is building the business and growing the business. And it also reduces the amount of attention they get from the regulators and the diversion of resources that entails. So, you know, there's lots of hidden benefits